I came home from a plumbing job and watched an HOA bulldozer erase my late wife's memorial garden like it was trash. They said it was community space. I said nothing, smiled, and let them finish the mistake that cost them $1.2 million. If you believe bullies only win when good people stay quiet, hit subscribe, because these HOA rules don't stand a chance against real paperwork, real boundaries, and real consequences. I had learned grief came in waves, not chapters. Some days I could function like a normal man, pack lunch, start the truck, show up for work, fix what was leaking, and collect a check. Other days, a smell or a song would open a trapdoor in my chest and I'd fall straight through it. That Tuesday in March, I came home tired, hands raw from copper fittings and cold crawl spaces, thinking about dinner for my daughter and whether I'd remembered to move the laundry from washer to dryer. I still measured my time in small responsibilities, because after my wife died, responsibilities were the only thing that kept the world from spinning off its axis. The backyard had been the one place that felt steady. Sarah had planted it while she was still fighting. She'd beaten breast cancer twice and believed, with a stubborn kind of faith, that beauty was a form of defiance. She chose David Austin roses because she liked the way they carried history in their scent. The garden wasn't big, but it was precise. Beds curved like calm handwriting. A small path of stone pavers led to a bench I'd built the summer after her second remission. She used to sit there on mornings when the neighborhood was quiet, mug warm in her hands, listening to birds and breathing like every clean inhale was a victory. After she was gone, that garden became a memorial without needing a plaque. It was where my daughter and I went when talking felt impossible. It was where I apologized to the air when I snapped from exhaustion. It was where I promised, on the worst nights, that I'd keep us standing. So when I turned onto my street and saw heavy equipment where it didn't belong, my body reacted before my mind did. A bulldozer sat in my driveway as if it had always lived there. Another machine idled near the back fence. Men in fluorescent vests moved with the confidence of people who believed they had permission. The air smelled like diesel and churned soil. And then I saw it, steel tracks rolling over the edge of my rose bed, compressing the earth where Sarah's hands had once pressed compost and hope. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I just stopped breathing for a moment, because what I was seeing didn't fit in my brain. Then it fit. The memorial garden was being erased. In minutes, the path disappeared under mud. Rose canes snapped and vanished beneath tracks like twigs under boots. The bench I'd built wasn't destroyed, but it sat crooked now, half sunk, like it was drowning. I could almost taste the salt of my own anger. Caroline Westfield, the HOA president, appeared like she'd stepped out of an ad for luxury real estate. White designer outfit. Perfect hair. Clean heels that didn't belong near mud. She walked across my yard without hesitation, as if grief and property lines were both negotiable. She had papers in her hand and a smile that belonged on someone taking keys at a gala. She offered me the look people give when they're about to explain why you should be grateful for the thing that just hurt you. I knew Caroline's type. I'd been a union plumber for decades, and I ran a small demolition side business for the jobs that needed muscle and a machine. Working-class men like me weren't invisible to everyone, only to people who preferred the world tidy and obedient. People like Caroline saw neighborhoods as products, residents as inventory, and rules as weapons. That morning, she used the gentlest voice to deliver the ugliest message. The HOA claimed the space. She referenced an old survey. She talked about community improvements. She framed my backyard like it was a shared amenity that had temporarily been mistaken for mine. And when she offered compensation, it landed like an insult thrown with polished nails. $3,000. A number that might sound generous in a board meeting, but meant nothing next to what they were crushing. I didn't argue in that moment. I didn't beg. I didn't give Caroline the satisfaction of watching me fall apart. I simply did what Sarah had always trusted me to do: document the truth. I pulled out my camera and started capturing everything: the equipment's positions, the track marks, the workers, the boundary stakes that were missing, the rose bed reduced to a torn brown scar. I photographed the papers Caroline waved around. I photographed the license plates of every vehicle on my property. I filmed the way they stepped over my fence line like it was chalk. Caroline kept talking. I kept recording. I knew something she didn't. People get careless when they think you're powerless. Grief makes you look soft to them. A widower with a teenage daughter looks like a problem they can outlast. They assume you'll choose peace over conflict, quiet over consequences. I had learned the opposite. When Sarah was sick, we didn't survive on hope alone. We survived on appointments, receipts, dates, and evidence. We survived by keeping records because hospitals lose paperwork and insurance companies deny reality. Evidence had saved our lives more than once. And now it was going to save our home. That night, my daughter came downstairs and found me at the kitchen table surrounded by county maps and HOA documents. She looked older than 17 in the way grief had pulled seriousness into her face. I could see fear under her calm. Not fear of machines. Fear of losing the last stable thing after losing her mother. I promised her the only promise that mattered: we would not be moved by bullies. Outside, the backyard sat torn open under moonlight, and the scent of roses was gone. But something else took its place in me, something firm, something focused. Caroline thought she had taken my weakest moment and used it against me. She had actually handed me a case. And the bigger the build, the harder the fall. The HOA escalated like they were following a playbook. Within 48 hours, violation notices appeared on my front door. They weren't subtle. They were designed to overwhelm: commercial vehicle restrictions, nuisance complaints, noise complaints, and a warning that my business activity could violate neighborhood covenants. Each notice carried a daily fine clause, the kind that looks harmless until it compounds into foreclosure. I had parked the same work trailer in the same driveway for years. No one had cared until Caroline needed leverage. That's how HOA power worked: rules were elastic until they were useful. Then I got the real message: compliance or consequences. My daughter felt it immediately at school. Not in official letters, but in the social freeze that spreads faster than any certified mail. Parents who'd once waved now looked through her. Invitations disappeared. A committee she'd worked hard for quietly replaced her with someone else. In a neighborhood like ours, reputation wasn't just social, it was currency. Caroline understood that. I understood it too. I just refused to spend my daughter's dignity to buy peace. I hired an independent surveyor with money I didn't really have. It hurt to do it, because the savings I had left felt like a lifeline. But I'd learned a brutal truth during Sarah's treatments: if you hesitate when a system is trying to crush you, you bleed out slowly. You act early, even when it costs. The survey took days. I watched the crew measure, mark, and map with calm precision while the HOA's clubhouse foundation rose like a monument to entitlement. I said nothing publicly. I let the work speak. When the results came back, they weren't fuzzy. They weren't arguable. They were exact. The clubhouse encroached 15 feet onto my property. Not inches. Not a disputed line. 15 feet, enough to turn Caroline's dream into a legal nightmare. But proving encroachment wasn't enough. I needed to understand how they got permits so fast, how they avoided setbacks, how they moved like the city belonged to them. The answer was as old as corruption itself: family connections. The building inspector on the approvals was tied to Caroline's orbit. Papers didn't lie, but signatures did. And when the wrong signature becomes routine, everyone assumes it's valid, until someone forces it into daylight. So I dug. I spent evenings at the county records office until the staff recognized me by the sound of my boots. I pulled older plats. I checked the development history. I studied setback requirements, wetland buffer maps, and the kind of zoning details most people never read. That's where I found something darker than a property line dispute. The site Caroline chose wasn't just near a wet area. It sat over a spring system that fed the neighborhood wells. Older records flagged it as environmentally sensitive. There should have been an environmental assessment on file, especially for a clubhouse with a pool and heavy excavation. The file said an assessment existed. The actual assessment did not. That absence felt loud. I called the consulting firm listed on the permit paperwork. They had no record of the project. I checked the specialist name tied to the approval. The signature belonged to someone who had been dead long enough that the ink should have been a ghost. That's when the whole thing shifted from HOA abuse to federal problem. Meanwhile, Caroline kept applying pressure. She tried to starve my work by poisoning my reputation. Clients stopped calling back. A regular customer canceled with a vague excuse that didn't match his usual blunt honesty. Another said he'd heard things. I knew exactly who had started those whispers. My daughter didn't need to say it, but I could see it in her shoulders. She wanted the nightmare to end. She didn't care about winning. She cared about stability. That kind of love makes a kid willing to accept injustice just so the house stays quiet. But quiet was what Caroline counted on. She counted on me folding. Instead, I expanded the scope. I didn't just collect evidence of the encroachment. I documented the construction's relationship to water, because if a foundation cracked a spring system, it wouldn't only hurt me. It would hurt every neighbor who drank from a well. It would become bigger than Caroline's board. And then the first proof showed up in a mason jar. A neighbor knocked on my door holding cloudy brown water like it was a confession. She said the well had tasted wrong for months. She said her husband had been sick. The timing matched the construction. I sent samples for testing. The results weren't ambiguous. Contaminants that didn't belong in drinking water were present, and the pattern pointed toward the construction site. Chemicals, bacteria risks, the kind of mix that happens when soil and runoff and disturbed systems collide. Caroline's beautiful clubhouse wasn't just stealing land. It was poisoning people. That changed everything, because federal law doesn't care who your friends are. It doesn't care about awards, committees, or HOA covenants. When protected habitat and clean water are involved, it stops being local theater and becomes a real case with real consequences. Caroline still thought she was in control because she owned the social scene and had the right connections. She didn't realize she'd stepped into a category of law where the connections don't matter and the penalties don't negotiate. And then, without knowing it, she did the one thing that made the trap snap shut. She tried to buy my silence. The offer came dressed as generosity. Flowers arrived with a neat note. A larger number. A fresh start. Enough money to tempt a man with bills and a daughter's future hanging in the balance, but not enough to erase what they'd done. It wasn't just about the garden anymore. It wasn't even just about my land. It was about the kind of power that decides grief is an opportunity. The kind of entitlement that tramples what's sacred and calls it improvement. I didn't respond with rage. I responded with evidence. I had learned a truth that felt almost spiritual in its simplicity. The truth doesn't need volume, it needs persistence. People who lie rely on exhaustion. They want you tired. They want you overwhelmed. They want you to doubt yourself until you accept their version of events. So I built a timeline. I organized every document. I labeled every photo. I backed up every file. I treated it like a job where failure meant someone getting hurt. Then I filed complaints the right way. Not with the HOA. Not with the inspector tied to Caroline's circle. Not with a local office that could lose paperwork. I took it federal. An investigator arrived with the calm seriousness of someone who had seen too many powerful people do ugly things behind polite curtains. She didn't care who Caroline was. She cared about what the evidence said and what the water tests proved. She reviewed the survey. She reviewed the missing environmental assessment. She reviewed the signature tied to a dead specialist. Her expression didn't become dramatic. It became precise. That precision was the beginning of the end. Because once federal agencies get involved, the timeline changes. It stops being maybe later. It becomes a sequence: notices, responses, enforcement, injunctions. And when the evidence includes forged documents and contamination, it stops being civil dispute and starts becoming criminal exposure. I stayed quiet publicly and let the process work. Caroline, sensing danger, escalated in the only ways she knew: intimidation and control. The HOA piled fines higher. She tried to get my work trailer towed. She tried to push neighbors into filing nuisance complaints. She tried to isolate my daughter further. But the neighborhood was shifting. When well water turns wrong, social lies can't fully cover the taste. When multiple families start asking questions, Caroline's community improvement story begins to sound like what it is: a weapon. The federal investigator interviewed more residents. More jars appeared. More tests confirmed the same pattern. What had started as my private heartbreak became a neighborhood issue. Caroline's power depended on people feeling alone. Evidence makes people feel connected. Then the subpoenaed communication surfaced, and the air changed completely. The emails weren't poetic. They were practical. They discussed fast-tracking approvals and using old signatures because nobody checks. There was even talk of a consulting fee, the kind of phrasing people use when they want bribes to sound like business. That's the moment where Caroline's image cracked. Not in gossip. In writing. A paper trail is a form of judgment. It doesn't care how perfect your smile is. I didn't celebrate yet. I kept moving. The federal investigator explained the part that mattered most to me. When ongoing harm is proven, federal court can order immediate cessation, and that includes removing the structure that caused the harm. In plain terms, the clubhouse would have to come down. Caroline had built a monument to herself on stolen ground, over protected systems, using fraudulent approvals. And now the law demanded it be removed. Caroline tried to stop the momentum with a bigger bribe, enough to look like mercy, enough to sound like peace. But it wasn't peace. It was hush money. I recorded everything. I gave the recording to counsel. In the world Caroline lived in, problems got handled quietly. In the world I lived in, quiet handling was how the wrong people got away with it. Then the sabotage happened. Someone cut hydraulic lines on my machine early one morning. It was intended to cripple my ability to respond and to scare me into backing off. It had the opposite effect. Because sabotage turns a civil dispute into something else. It shows intent. It shows fear. It shows someone knows they're losing. By then, law enforcement attention had widened. Federal eyes don't blink at designer heels. They don't flinch at neighborhood politics. They follow the documents and the money and the harm. Caroline had spent months acting like she could rewrite reality. Now reality was written down. The court date landed like a fixed star. No matter what games Caroline played locally, the federal hearing would happen. And in the background, Caroline made one last arrogant choice that would magnify her downfall perfectly. She scheduled a grand opening party for the clubhouse. She invited local dignitaries, award judges, and everyone who had ever praised her leadership. She planned to celebrate her theft and her destruction with champagne. She didn't realize she was timing her own humiliation. The morning of the hearing, I didn't feel fear. I felt clarity. It's a strange gift grief gives you after enough time. You stop caring about looking polite to people who are committed to hurting you. You stop negotiating with cruelty. You stop believing that civility will soften someone who has already decided your pain is useful. The federal courtroom was not dramatic. It was orderly, which is the most terrifying thing to corrupt people. The judge reviewed the evidence like it was weight on a scale. Survey encroachment. Forged environmental approvals. Missing assessments. Water contamination documented across multiple homes. A clear pattern of willful disregard. Communications that suggested coordination, shortcuts, and bribes. The judge didn't need a speech from me. The documents spoke with a certainty my voice could never match. The order came down with the kind of force that feels final: cease harmful activity, restore the habitat, remediate the water damage, and remove the structure responsible for the continuing violation. Removal. Not fix. Not negotiate. Remove. Then came the restitution, the costs of restoration, damages tied to property loss, punitive consequences for willful misconduct. The total landed at $1.2 million. It wasn't a lottery. It was a bill. A bill for arrogance. I didn't smile in the courtroom. I didn't need to. I held the thought of Sarah's roses like a prayer, and simply nodded as if God himself had signed the order. When we returned to the neighborhood, the clubhouse stood there dressed for celebration, decorations, catering vehicles, people arriving in their best outfits to congratulate themselves on living somewhere. Excellent. They didn't know their queen had fallen. Then the sound arrived. A diesel engine rolling slow, steady, unavoidable. Federal supervision. Legal authorization. Equipment positioned with care. The crowd turned as if a storm had entered the street. I climbed down from the machine and stood where my wife's garden used to be, now churned soil and tire tracks. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. The federal order was clear. The structure had to come down. People argued. People questioned. People tried to call Caroline. But the truth was bigger than their disbelief, and disbelief doesn't stop a court order. The first strike was measured. Controlled. Safe. I wasn't swinging in rage. I was executing remediation. The pool cracked and collapsed into itself. The sound echoed off manicured hedges like a warning. As the demolition progressed, it looked less like destruction and more like correction. Each section removed exposed what the clubhouse had hidden: disturbed earth, cracked pathways of water, unnatural pooling. When the foundation broke open, cold spring water began to move again in its old direction, clearer than it had been in months. Neighbors who had been afraid started speaking to each other again, not in whispers, but in shared recognition of what had happened. When clean flow returned, it felt like the neighborhood itself exhaled. My daughter arrived and watched from a safe distance. She didn't cheer. She didn't cry. She simply stood there with the stillness of someone learning what justice looks like in the real world. By late afternoon, the clubhouse was rubble. Not a symbol of prestige, evidence of wrongdoing removed. And in that empty space, something strange happened. The backyard felt like it belonged to us again. Not because the pain was gone, but because the invasion was over. Restoration began quickly. Habitat work, remediation planning, soil rebuilding. I used part of the restitution to fund proper repairs and quietly, to make sure the families with contaminated wells got help. I also did something that mattered to my spirit more than money ever could. I rebuilt the memorial garden. Not the exact same way, because grief doesn't rewind, but with the same intention. Roses again. A new bench. A small stone marker with Sarah's name. And a small channel of water lined with river rock, honoring the spring and the way life insists on moving forward. Caroline's power dissolved with her image. The HOA board fractured. People who had once smiled at her speeches started asking for audits, resignations, transparency. The community excellence obsession collapsed under the weight of reality. I didn't become a hero. I became a man who refused to be erased. Months later, on a calm morning, the roses bloomed again. The scent returned. My daughter sat beside me and talked about her future with less fear in her voice. And I realized the deepest revenge wasn't the demolition or the money. It was this. The thing Caroline tried to destroy, our stability, our dignity, our peace, was the exact thing that grew back stronger. Because bullies depend on silence. And the moment you document the truth and refuse to surrender, you stop being their target. You become their consequence.